On this episode of Locked On Lightning, we're continuing our 2004 Stanley Cup playoff run rewatch. We talk about the Game 4 win for the Tampa Bay Lightning, as well as how do we see certain things that remind us of past Lightning Stanley Cup teams. All that coming up and more on Locked On Lightning.
You're Locked On Lightning, your daily podcast on the Tampa Bay Lightning, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome to another episode of Locked On Lightning, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Adam Denker. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Locked On Lightning. On tonight's episode, we're talking about continuing basically our playoff rewatch of the 2004 Stanley Cup run. We talk about the Game 4 win over the Islanders in the Eastern Conference quarterfinals, as well as some of the things that remind us of current or more recent Stanley Cup winning Lightning teams. We break it all down. We talk about our prediction for Game 5 and more. But before we grab any of those topics, I just want to remind you that today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Before we jump into that topic as well, please go ahead and subscribe to the podcast. Give us a follow wherever podcasts are distributed in audio form. We're also available on YouTube, so go ahead, drop a comment below this episode, whether it's related to it or not, whether it be, about something more current going on with the Lightning or just a topic that you want me to talk about. Now is the time to do it, because once we get into the regular season, it's going to be fast, it's going to be furious, it's going to be crazy, and it's definitely going to be a very exciting season for the Tampa Bay Lightning, as we all know. But as for the time being, we are taking a step back, as if you're joining us for the first time, taking a rewatch of the entire playoff run in which the Lightning ended up winning their first Stanley Cup championship in 2004. We're celebrating the 20th anniversary of all that. And right now we're taking a look at the Eastern Conference quarterfinal matchup against the New York Islanders. The Lightning went into this game up 2-1, and we talked about it in the last episode, and I'm curious for those of you that are rewatching the games with us and following along. I spoke about it because it's very interesting, and not only with the Lightning, it has to do with really with every Stanley Cup championship team. If you're rewatching the games, it's always nice to go back and even in real time see when the team turns it on, or at least when the group of players that will eventually be the heroes, and one of them eventually be the Conn Smythe Trophy winner, see the players start to turn it on, start to figure it out. And in this series, Game 4, you're starting to see them turn it on. You start to see players really kind of figure things out. As for this game, I really thought that the Lightning really just played an all-around better game. They didn't have as many shots on goal. They only had 20 as opposed to the Islanders 33. They didn't necessarily do a good job in the face-off circle either, where the Islanders were over 55%, or at least at the 55% mark. They didn't execute really well on or at all on the power play. The Islanders didn't either. And you didn't see really an overly physical game in terms of hits. It seemed most at times that the Islanders really were just dominating this game, but the Islanders did eventually lose to the Lightning 3-0. And Nikolai Khabibulin is really part of the reason why. And we'll talk about it a little later on in this episode. His comparison, that we kind of see shades of Andrei Vasilevskiy, because we've gotten to see it twice now with Andrei Vasilevskiy when he's turned it on. And I've talked about it numerous times with him, that you don't necessarily need highlight saves to go ahead and necessarily win games. You just need to be solid. And the 04 Lightning got that throughout this series, and we'll see more in Game 5. How Nikolai Khabibulin, he's made his spectacular saves here and there, but it's really not until the Stanley Cup final where we really see Hobby, I think, in my opinion, get to or really cement his playoff legend as what maybe some Lightning fans may reminisce about him today. As for this series, the thing that I've really enjoyed seeing as for the Lightning was them just figuring it out, just trying to find ways to win. And I think that's really important, especially in this era in hockey where it's not like today where it's finesse and really speed. And I know the playoffs are a little different. You kind of get back to basics during the Stanley Cup playoffs. But I feel like with this era, early 2000s hockey, still a lot of influence from the generation beforehand where you have that overlap. Very much physical, very much a little bit more structured. The thing that really kind of annoyed me throughout the course of the first couple of games, and this is just a testament to the style of hockey that was played at the time, the Lightning just taking slap shots, just clearing the puck as soon as they get into the zone, whether it to be make a line change or in the middle of a line change. If you've been a listener of this podcast for quite some time, I'm very adamant about dump and run and getting pucks into the corners. And I feel like we'll see some of that, especially later on in this playoff run, because I feel like the Lightning, to a certain extent, they're still playing very hesitant. They are doing the little things. You saw it in this game. They had 24 block shots, and really that was the thing I think really contributed to really frustrating the Islanders out there, not allowing them to get anything going. And on the same breath, allowing Hobby to really be able to settle in and not allow any goals. And I really think that was the deciding factor in this one. You did get goals, though, from Marty St. Louis, Ruslan Fedotenko, and Freddie Modin. Modin got his third of the series. St. Louis got also his third of the series, which was an unassisted shorthanded goal in the first period, which really, I think, we talked about it in the last night's episode about how really that game was pretty much decided early on. Once the Lightning got the second goal in Game 3, you kind of got the feeling, if you were watching the game, that was it. That was it for this Lightning, for the Islanders. They weren't going to be able to answer back, especially with the way the Lightning were playing in terms of physicality and all that stuff. And you kind of saw it in this one as well. But I felt like I just got the impression early on with the St. Louis goal. You came out early, 10 and a half minutes into the first period. Islanders are on a power play. It seems like things are starting to tip in favor of the Islanders. And boom, you go out there, you score a goal, you punch them right in the gut. And really, in a series like this, especially where you're already down 2-1 and the margin of error is just so small, if even if it exists, it's one of those things where you're basically just wiping away in my opinion, any confidence and that maybe they would have brought in or any momentum that this team would have been able to bring into this game to get things going, to maybe tie things up, but that wasn't the case. And I think that's really important for this Lightning team going forward as well. Past this series, as we all know, it's not a matter, of course, of we're not talking here on this podcast as we take a look back on the games. It's not a matter of what if. We all know what's going to happen, but at the same time, I think it's how they do it, I think, is really the most important important part here that we all need to focus on when we're looking back on these games and talking about it. So let me know in the comments below. I mean, what are some of the things that stood out to you from this game? Spoiler alert, the thing that stood out to me the most, obviously, was the block shots. But other than that, I mean, Nikolai Khabibulin, we all know what happens and how he plays throughout the course of the playoffs. But how he played in this game, and we're starting to see shades of him really, and this isn't any case, whether it be 2004, 2020, 2021, all instances in which Lightning goaltenders getting super comfortable and gaining a ton of confidence, and when those guys are on, very few teams are able to win those series. So we'll talk about those two guys, those two goaltenders, Nikolai Khabibulin and Andrei Vasilevskiy. We'll talk about that coming up in just a little bit. But first, we're going to talk about today's sponsor, and that is our friends over at the Game Time app. Now, listen, if you haven't heard about Game Time, summer is the perfect time to capitalize on all the great deals and sales that Game Time offers, because they offer things that have sentimental value. And Game Time was responsible for it. The first sporting event I got to go to after the pandemic kind of starting to end and things were starting to open up, got to go to a hockey game with my dad. And that was something that, we both really looked forward to on a yearly basis, numerous times. And, being able to do that, especially on his birthday, I mean, Game Time was great about it. They were able to offer me a great deal for a hockey game. And you can too, because Game Time is the place for last minute killer deals, all in prices and views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee. Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying tickets. They have some phenomenal features on this app. If you haven't heard about Game Time, they have last minute deals. You could save up to 60% off buying tickets last minute for sports, concert, comedy, theater, etc. You could save even more with exclusive in-app deals on select seats ahead of the game or the event. They also have their lowest price guarantee, or Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Create an account and redeem the code LOCKEDONHL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices, guaranteed. So as always, I want to thank you all for making us your first listen of the day. If you haven't already done so, please go ahead and subscribe to the podcast. Give us a follow wherever podcasts are distributed in audio form. We're also available on YouTube. Subscribe to our channel there. Hit that notification button on any app or platform that you're listening to us on, so as soon as the newest episode drops, you'll be notified. And if you want to reach out to me or to the podcast, go ahead. LOCKEDONH. I'm getting my promo codes and my Twitter stuff. It's Locked On NHL on Twitter, as well as Locked On NHL on Instagram. Locked On Lightning. And you could find more of my work at boltsbythebay.com and at DankyDank on Twitter. So I love watching these old games with the Lightning because I just feel like it's super nostalgic, especially when you start in 2004 and especially if you watched closely the two Stanley Cup championships, was that really you saw shades of the other within itself. It was almost like they were mirror images at certain times, and I think that really we could all agree. I kind of hinted to it in last night's episode, and well, not really hinted to it. I did talk about it, about how I always like seeing when teams start to clamp down, that eventually do win the cup. As for the 2020 Lightning, my fond memory was the series in which they beat Boston. I said at the time, if they could get past Boston and get lucky with not having to play Philly, I see a clear path to the cup and winning it as well. I don't think there was any team coming out of the West that year that was going to be able to compete with the Lightning, especially with the way Andrei Vasilevskiy was in net And you saw a lot of that momentum that he picked up in the playoffs carried over to the following year in 2021, in which they beat the Montreal Canadiens. And you look at the playoffs in 2004 for the Tampa Bay Lightning, and you almost got to think sort of the same. I mean, then again, the East was a little different then. I think a lot of it had to do with luck as well coming out of the West. You had the Detroit Red Wings, who were arguably the best team of that era, late 90s, early 2000s, multiple championships, President's Trophy winners that season, getting bounced in the second round and in the conference semifinals by Calgary. Talk about, with those Lightning, with that Lightning team, a little bit of luck there. I don't know how the Lightning then would have been able to match up against a team like Detroit, facing off against Calgary. I'm very curious to see what San Jose would have been like back then. Not familiar with the Sharks and how they played back then, but the Lightning being able to play the Islanders, that, as we all know, this is really not much of a matchup. Yeah, the Islanders show a little fight in game 2, but that's pretty much it. But the big story in this series thus far is Khabibulin being able to settle in relatively easily into games. And that's where I see the comparisons right away with Khabi and Vazzy is that these two guys, the worst thing you could do, especially when they're on in the playoffs. I mean, I hate to sound cliche here, but really what it comes down to is that both these guys have a switch in the playoffs that once it's switched on, they become almost unbeatable. Yeah, he'll have some chinks on his armor as he goes throughout the playoffs, and that's normal for any goaltender. I don't care who it is and how accomplished they are and really how well they're playing. All it takes is a bad bounce, and you could very well be back in the game. But with Khabi and Vazzy, I think the similarities lie here is that really, you as an opposing team have to find that happy medium where you got to challenge them and put good shots on the net, and be able to get them uncomfortable in the crease. But all it takes is a couple of big saves from them, and not only are they going to be shut down for not only the rest of the night, but the rest of the series. And then on the other side of that, which is the other extreme, I guess you could call it, is that really, if you're trying to be very selective with your shots, as we've seen with Vasilevskiy, that could hurt you and benefit you as an opposing player, hurt you in a way to where he gets comfortable. He sees maybe 5 shots in the first period, gets the confidence up, but doesn't have to work too much. Khabi, the same thing in this series in 2004 against the Islanders. It's almost like he gets more comfortable when he's not challenged as much, even if he's facing a lot of shots in a period, even if they're just hitting him right in the logo of the sweater. If he's going through that motion and kind of getting a sense of where the game is going, I think, he's in my opinion, he's kind of a game manager goaltender where he just has to get to the next save and he'll be fine. And I feel like Vasilevskiy is kind of like that too as well, where both these guys, like I said, I've said this repeatedly throughout this series of us talking about this, as well as over the years with Vasilevskiy. He doesn't need much to get in the game. And really, as an opposing team, you have to exercise some level of caution in that respect. Too much caution is something that could definitely hurt you. And we're seeing it here definitely on this rewatch. I'm very curious though to see, because as, like I said, someone who didn't really, because I was young, I was 12 when this happened. I wasn't really exposed to Khabi until later on in his career, really, where I got to see him a little bit more. I was a little bit more exposed to him during his time in Chicago and a little bit in Edmonton and then back in Chicago, where he finished his career. But it's one of those things where you look at him, I would imagine as an opposing player, 6'1", 208, not genuinely imposing. A lanky goaltender, kind of has a small frame in terms of how his presence in the ice in the creases. Whereas Vasilevskiy, I mean, he just looms large. He's just a big guy. He takes up a lot of space. Also, I will give it the pads are a little bigger now, so there's that as well. But it's always great to see how goaltenders really come into their own in the playoffs. I mean, you could name other goaltenders as well. Most recently, Jeff Skinner from the Edmonton Oilers. Really, what a big redemption story that was in the playoffs. I mean, even though the Oilers came up short to the Panthers, I thought his performance after getting pulled early in the first couple of series, I thought he really did a good job of coming back in and just turning on the switch. I mean, you could look even at the Panthers. Bobrovsky was on for most of the playoffs. He gets to the Stanley Cup final. He has a couple of bad performances, especially just allowing the Panthers to get back in that series. I mean, allowing the Oilers to get back in that series. And I know it's not just on him in that regard. It's the whole team. But to be able to come back for a game 7 and just figure it out as the game goes on, sometimes that's all it takes is to win games. And really, spoiler alert, I mean, we will see that with Hobby throughout that series against Calgary. I mean, that going back and watching that during the pandemic and talking about it, and then, just thinking about it now from everything I remember from that series, for a lot of Lightning fans that maybe have never seen that before, I would say probably you will probably say that's when Hobby turned it on, but I think this is when it was, but that's going to be a great series that I look forward to. But I think when we look back after it's all said and done with this whole rewatch, we're going to say, possibly game 4 against the Islanders was when Nikolai Khabibulin turned it on in the playoffs. So wrapping things up on the show one last time, as always, I want to thank you all for making us your first listen of the day. If you haven't already done so, please go ahead and subscribe to the podcast. Give us a follow wherever podcasts are distributed in audio form. You can follow my work over at boltsbythebay.com. You can follow us on our social media pages at @L_Lightning on Twitter, as well as _Lightning on Instagram. Give me a follow on Twitter at DankyDank, DENKYD8NK. And stay tuned with us as we continue our watch through of this 2004 Stanley Cup run, where the Lightning faced off against the New York Islanders in the Eastern Conference quarterfinal. The Lightning, as we are wrapping up this podcast, pretending like we're in 2004, the Lightning are up in this series 3-1, looking to close it out back at home. And really the thing here that you're looking as John Tortorella and really a Lightning player and a Lightning fan at the time is just freaking win. I don't know exactly how the series worked out back then. Montreal Boston does go to 7, and the Lightning do end up playing Montreal from that series. Montreal, of course, winning in game 7. So really, you're kind of looking at the other series, and this is kind of just like the general creed, I think it is, for a lot of hockey teams in the first round of the playoffs, as well as just other series as well. If you have a chance to close out the series, just get it done. You don't want to keep a team in it, because the longer you do, the longer they'll find their mojo, the longer they'll figure, and the more faster they'll figure out. I mean, look at the Stanley Cup the Stanley Cup final, Panthers Oilers. Panthers weren't able to get it done, and they just kept the Oilers in the series, and they almost had one of the biggest upsets in NHL Stanley Cup final history. And that would have been I think, the best consolation for Lightning fans, if that were to happen. But obviously it did not. But looking at game 5 for this series, you're just going out there and you're leaving it all on the line. You're going out there and playing like it's a game 7. You're expecting big minutes from your top guns. You're expecting Marty St. Louis to go out there, who's been having a phenomenal series at this point. Like I said, 3 goals thus far through 4 games, en route to him just having a stellar Stanley Cup playoff and eventually, I know this might be controversial, but I think that, if you look at his numbers, regardless of how you felt about Brad Richards, I still think that really at the end of the day, I think it should have been Marty St. Louis. That should have been the Conn Smythe. I mean, who knows? Maybe my opinion will change about that. Richards did end up having 26 points in the entire playoffs, but still, if anybody has been a listener of this podcast, I mean, I'm a huge Marty St. Louis fan. That's why I got into the Lightning. That's why I got into covering the Lightning. And really, I think that, you got to get Richards, who I just mentioned. You got to get him going. You would like to see more, or really more so, continued offense from Freddie Modin. Just get some of the lower lines involved as well. Obviously, in a playoff, you want to have all 3 forward lines playing. Everybody throwing their weight around as well, as we all know on a John Tortorella team. That's going to be the main focus, that and blocking shots, making things easy for your goaltender, and that's pretty much it. I would expect the Lightning to leave it all out in the line, regardless if it's a blowout or if it's a close game, or even a game that goes to overtime. Wink, wink. So let me know in the comments below if you're following along. How you feeling about this if you're watching it for the first time, as well as how does this compare to maybe other playoff runs with the Lightning, the other 2 Stanley Cup final runs that eventually did see them bring home Lord Stanley. So we'll be back tomorrow to talk about Game 5 as Lightning attempt to shut things out, shut the whole series down, and kind of just wait for Boston and Montreal to conclude. So in the meantime, that's been it for this episode of Locked On Lightning, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Adam Danker. I'll talk to you in the next one.